welcome everybody back and hope that everyone had an enjoyable time last evening. It was a great discussion, I think, at our plenary. I want to talk about, anybody ever go for a romantic walk past that with your spouse? Suggest that for your anniversary sometime. This is what we have built in the United States. That is not Carmel, for the record. Then we have things like this as well. That certainly is walkable. And I suppose if you're walking from your car to a box, it's walkable. And that's the worst example, I think. As we look at these, one of my jobs as mayor has been to convince the people that I represent that we need to build our city in a different way than other suburban communities and other communities in general, that we can do better. And there's a group of people who are always interested in quality of life. They understand the importance of quality of life to workforce development. They understand beauty for beauty's sake, why we want beautiful buildings and beautiful art. But then there's a large group of people who don't pay much attention to those things. They may be more concerned about taxes and finances. And it's that group of people that I struggled for some time. How do I explain to them why we are doing what we are doing here in Carmel? So we started to do more analysis of the financial and fiscal reasons. Of course, I understood these things because, I'm focused on it every day, as is my staff. But how do you explain these things to the average voter, the average person? Voters are important, every 4 years for me. This is one of my favorites. I always show people and get a good laugh because, think about it, these men are paying to go get on a piece of exercise equipment. But yet they're choosing to take the elevator to that piece of exercise equipment. And this is so typical of how Americans think about exercise and think about their lives. We put an escalator to a fitness center so somebody can go get on a Stairmaster and do steps. And we try to get people thinking outside the box a bit, but some of the best ways of explaining why we're doing what we're doing in terms of mixed-use, walkable, pedestrian-friendly development are charts like this. This is actually prepared for an office building almost across the street, where we showed that we had a typical 10,000 square foot building, $2 a square foot property tax rate. We received $20,000 as a community in property tax because parking lots, let's face it, just aren't assessed at very much value and don't pay much in taxes. Then option B, the same site with 200,000 square feet, 5 40,000 square foot buildings with underground parking, of course, to accommodate the cars, $400,000 of revenue. Well, that's nice. People say that. It's nice. But then I point out what the infrastructure to support those developments cost. A 2-lane road with storm sewers, lighting, bike path or sidewalk along the side, curbs, maybe a few street trees, $12 million a mile. Then you add to that extension of your sanitary sewer system, extension of your water system, at millions more. Electric lines, even if the municipality doesn't own the electric company, there's still a cost. Gas lines, same thing. Then there's a cost of police and fire as we sprawl out. We know that people police each other to a large extent, so you don't need as many police officers if you're in a denser area. We also know that a fire station, relatively inexpensive to build, $2 or $3 million for the station, But then you have to staff that station 4 shifts a week, in essence, 4 firefighters per shift. It comes out between $4 and $5 million a year. So if you're developing in an area that already has that fire station in place, already has the police in place, already has the storm sewers and the road infrastructure and all those other things, we can borrow against that new tax revenue, the difference between the $20,000 and the $400,000, use that money to build the underground parking, which is what allows us to put the greater square footage on that site. And note, we're not talking about large towers, as we discussed a bit last night, because the construction costs incrementally get so much more as you go up, and there's a lot of other reasons we don't want to go that high. Our max is usually 4 to 6 levels with an average of about 5 stories, just the way the older traditional cities of Europe were built for centuries before structural steel. There's another example. There you see the before picture, Sophia Square, where we'll be, I believe, tomorrow night. That building has a 2-level underground parking structure. It has an interior courtyard that's open to the public right on the Monon Trail. The increased value of that city block went up by 3,386%. These buildings you see in the top right picture, the before views, tax revenue for the city was $14,517, almost $1 million after it was reconstructed or after the new building was built. And this is another example comparing that same building. Anybody here from Fishers today? Next door, our neighboring community? Good, because I'm going to talk about it. A couple were signed up, and they apparently heard I was going to do this. They have 50 acres dedicated to an IKEA store and something called Top Golf. You familiar with that? It's an elevated thing. We hit golf balls into a big net, acreage, as you can see, it's right along Interstate I-69. It's on the right. It's just under 50 acres. Sophia Square, the one I just showed you, this one, is on 2.1 acres. The assessed value per acre for the big box IKEA store and the Top Golf facility, most of which are parking lots, comes out to $1 million an acre. Our Sophia Square, 2 acres, comes out to $23.5 million an acre of assessed value. And so the difference in tax revenue is huge. Apply our 2% tax rate, commercial tax rate, to those, and you see the difference. And that's just the revenue side. Then again, look at the expense side. As you sprawl out over that 50 acres, you need more road, more police, more fire. If you do this within 2 acres, you're not sprawling out. You don't need as much street and all the services to police and provide fire protection along that street. This is the city of Indianapolis, which is directly to our south, and the large city in the area, of course, just under 1 million people. And they struggle with their finances and have for the last 60 years or so. They did something called Unigov in 1969 when Mayor Dick Lugar was in office, which was to combine the county with the city, similar to what Miami and Dade County did. Louisville has since done something similar, as have a lot of other cities. And for a lot of policy reasons, that made sense. But what it did, and what was not anticipated, I think, at the time that it was done in 1969, was that it enabled lots of sprawl. They could have preserved it, done urban growth boundaries within the city of Indianapolis, but this graphic is interesting because it shows the purple. That's a very dense area. It's under a mile square out of the hundreds of square miles of the city of Indianapolis. And then you see the red, which is maybe some two-story area in the city, maybe 3 or 4 in certain areas. Then the rest, various shades of green, which means sprawl. This is why their finances are upside down. Hundreds of miles, thousands of miles, actually several thousand miles of roads to maintain, not enough revenue to pay for it, let alone police, provide fire protection, not to mention schools and quality of life issues and parks, public art, things that make a city more livable. Of course, they focused on the downtown area, which makes sense given those conditions, but to build a lot of these amenities in the downtown area is very nice, but at the expense of the rest, 99% of the rest of the city. The road infrastructure is in terrible condition. It's going to take over billions and billions of dollars to fix it appropriately because money has been taken from that to go into. It's just the finances are upside down, and it's because of sprawl. So often we even see the traditional cities, which have expanded their boundaries, building a suburban development pattern that is terrible for their finances. Here's an example of what we did with a big box. You know, it's a fact of life that people want to occasionally shop in big boxes, and you have to accommodate them. But instead of a group of cars, a ugly parking lot, in this case, we just moved the cars to the back. But you see, we did require 2-story buildings on either side of that sports store, and made it a walkable, pedestrian-friendly area in front. It doesn't take that much to do that. And we don't like the big boxes, but sometimes we have to do it. And if we do, though, we try to pay a lot of attention to how you do it in a way that enhances and does not make the community worse. This is one of our new projects within a stone's throw of this building. And if you look at the top picture, you'll see our main fire station. The Palladium is just up in the top. If that picture in the top went another, just a little ways farther, you'd see the building we're in. That tree line to the left is the Monon Trail. But we had that parking lot to the top of the fire station, to the north of that fire station. Then you see the construction to the north of that. Well, today that is something called the Veterans Way Garage, a 6-story parking structure with some pedestrian retail on the ground floor. And because that building was there, we no longer needed that service parking lot. So the city sold the old service parking lot that used to serve the fire station. And this project in the lower picture is under construction. Hasn't really come out of the ground yet, but utilities and so on is going in, earth is being moved. And so beforehand, since this was a city parking lot, after our residential, owner-occupied residential is taxed, property taxes are 1/2 the rate of commercial in Carmel. So we'll then start to receive $158,000 for that area, but what a beautiful enhancement as well. The proscenium is just to our south as well. There's some boards explaining that project in the lobby. There you see it at the top before, a few years ago, that bluish steel building at the top of the right picture was originally a screw and bolt manufacturing plant, later a party supply store. Then you see the Arby's restaurant. The city bought both those properties. It took quite a while to do it, raised them, worked with a private development firm, and the picture in the lower left is that development is almost completed. But again, the property tax value of that site, without any additional revenue to speak of, went from $34,000 to $922,000. Do we have to make the street better, or do we have to spend a lot of money on the street? No. We did have to do a little bit of stormwater work on this one. Police, fire, already in place. This is one that has yet to start. It's farther south on Rangeline Road, about 3/4 of a mile, which is the road running north-south, just to the right of the hotel as you walk out the main door. That shopping center at the top has now been raised, and this project at the left is about to be built. 5 stories again, interior parking hidden by the building, $52,000 of revenue, up to almost $1.2 million in revenue. And people are paying attention across the country. This was 3 American neighborhoods are emerging as economic powerhouses in Business Insider. 2 large cities, South Park and Charlotte, and Capitol Riverfront, D.C., and then they listed our downtown redevelopment as well. And that's great publicity to get, but it's so important that the local community, who may not read this magazine, most people won't, understand the financial reasons why new urbanism makes sense. We can talk all day about quality of life and, as I said, workforce development, building a better city because we all want to live in a better city, and that appeals to some people, but not all people. To a group of people, the most important thing are the finances. Are my taxes going to go up? Does this make sense? And they see the city spending a lot of money on parking structures and sculptures and roundabouts and our road diet on this road that runs past a lot of these projects. And they see that money being spent and they think, oh, the city's just spending money again. I'm against this. And so it takes constant explanation and discussion with community groups about why this makes fiscal sense. And I think sometimes it's those of us who are interested and passionate about good design, passionate about beautiful buildings, passionate about art, about landscaping, creating places that inspire people, we forget to talk about the fiscal side of it. But to a large segment of people, that's very important. So thank you. I hope you have a wonderful day. I'm going to turn it back over to Michael Mehaffy.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to set up this session by telling you a little bit about, first of all, 2 of the 3 panelists that are good colleagues of mine at the center in Stockholm. I think many of you may know that I have been involved with Peter Umland and Tigran Haas, who are both board members of the IMCL, and they are also at the Center for the Future of Places in Stockholm. And David Brain and Vikas Mehta are good colleagues and collaborators of ours there, and they will be speaking about some of their work. But I also want to tell you about some of the work of the center in general. And I mentioned yesterday the Habitat 3 conference that some of you may know about, and the outcome document known as the New Urban Agenda. And I think that is a very big deal because essentially it is expressing a lot of the things that we're all talking about here today. How do we make more human-centered cities and towns and suburbs? How do we make places that serve human interests, all human interests, not just those of the people who manage to become wealthy? And how do we make, because it turns out that that's better for everybody in the long run. It's a more sustainable way of settling and of building cities and towns and suburbs. And so that's really what the New Urban Agenda is all about. It's also what the Sustainable Development Goals are all about, as you may have heard about. The COP21 climate negotiations, as you know, the Paris Accords that were agreed in 2015. The United States is now part of that as well. It's about how do we prepare for the future in a more comprehensive way, in a way that's a better quality of life for everyone as we get ready for this. So Habitat 3 has now been, or the New Urban Agenda rather, has now been adopted by acclamation by all 193 countries of the United Nations. So that's a great framework. And we at our center have been part of that. We developed a partnership, Peter Elmland of the Axon Johnson Foundation developed a partnership with UN Habitat. You'll hear from Andrew Rudd, who's a human settlements officer, or urban settlements officer, tomorrow, and also with a project for public spaces. And you'll hear from Ethan Kent. He's going to be doing a session. Fred Kent, his father, was the founder of Project for Public Spaces. And we've been involved with them for a 4-year period of doing conferences, looking at what language might go into the new urban agenda, especially around public space and around the issues related to public space. A lot of people involved in that, over 1,500 people, researchers, practitioners, officials, activists, 700 organizations, 275 cities, 100 countries. So lots of involvement from lots of people, and maybe some of you have been involved. There's Doug Kelbaugh, for example, right up there, who has been a close partner in all of this, and a number of other good colleagues as well. There's Seth Alo, who you'll hear via video a little later this morning. And we generated a series of key messages that talk about the importance of public space, which I'll talk about also a little later, as a kind of connective network that gives us everything that cities give us that's so fundamental. And we certainly realize that now with the pandemic. So there's a series of key messages that came out that essentially say public space is a critical resource, a critical urban commons that we all need in order to get the benefits from cities. So when the new urban agenda was adopted, we said, now what? You know, how are we going to implement this structure? And one of the key issues was, how do you translate the research, what we know from different areas of knowledge and expertise, into practice? This is a big mission of the IMCL is you know, it doesn't do any good to have research sitting on the shelf. It doesn't do any good to have practitioners flying blind and maybe making the same mistakes over and over. We need a good cycle of research into practice, back into research, back into practice. And so that's what the Center for the Future of Places is all about. And David and Vikas have been part of that, bringing that into a clearer picture, trying to translate that in a number of publications and documents and a database that I'll mention, I'll describe in a moment. But again, the critical need to find ways to implement those things. And this, of course, is at a historic moment, not only with the pandemic, but with unprecedented rapid urbanization around the globe. I think the statistics are rather shocking that in the next 50 years, or in the 50 years since 2010, we will have built more urban fabric than we have in the entire history of humanity. So this is a shocking recognition, especially when you realize that much of it is informal and very chaotic, and you know, slums and so on, and those are clearly not helping people to have a better quality of life, at least not in the conditions that they're facing. They're coming to those cities to get a better quality of life, but they're certainly being deprived of that when they're in the slums. And then the market rate development that we've been talking about here, that is, as we all recognize, tends to be very auto-dominated, resource-intensive, high emissions, and so on. And this is, again, happening all around the world. And in both cases, this is failing to fully provide what cities can provide for human beings. And this is the challenge, that we need to think of cities as connective systems that bring us into proximity with each other and with our resources, and that give us the ability to grow and prosper and interact and build collaborative networks and economic networks, and to thrive and to grow. And this is my friend Mike Batty and his colleague Peter Ferguson who put it this way. So the physical system of the city needs to connect us so that we can interact, so that we can prosper and do well. Data networks and all the other things are supplements to that, but the research shows that they don't give us the extra connections that the city itself gives us through its public space networks, through its streets and its squares and its parks, through its public space systems. You know, there's research that shows that the connections that you have online tend to remain the connections that you have. In fact, there's worrying evidence that it tends to reinforce, and we get into these bubbles, right? Getting out into the public space is where you have what they call propinquity and proximity, right? You run into somebody and serendipity. You run into somebody and you say, oh, I've got a cousin who knows something about that. And you have these random encounters, these weak ties as they call them. And this is something that Jane Jacobs talked about a lot in Death and Life, this very, very important capacity that cities have to, that it gives us choice and rich opportunity. It gives us a fluidity and a choice among different people to mix and to be diverse and to have all the cultural activities and the enterprises of all kinds. You can draw from this great pool. The bigger the pool, the better. The more interconnected and joined up it is, the better, with all the parts of the city that can exist in extraordinary variety. And then in turn, that gives choices for people, for not only for jobs, for goods, for entertainment, ideas, contacts and services, and so on and so forth. So I think we need to recognize that cities are engines of human well-being, or they should be if they're working properly, cities and towns and suburbs, of course. And that fundamentally, as Jacobs pointed out, it comes down to what she called the lowly sidewalk, where the small change of random encounters, the small change from which a city's wealth of public life may grow. And this is in Oslo, and you can see lots of people moving, the sidewalk ballet, as she referred to it. That's so wonderful and so important. And it's a connective network that extends all the way across the city, not just in one locality, like the tissues of a leaf, the capillaries and so on. And it fundamentally relies upon that public space as the ultimate connective network. We only really have private spaces because we have public spaces that connect them. If I'm out in the middle of nowhere and I say I have a private space, what does that mean? That's pretty meaningless unless you have an adjacent private space connected by public space. So public space is the connective matrix or the connective framework. And we're recognizing how incredibly important that is on so many levels. So what our group has been doing, and Vikas and David has been part of it, is creating a database on all the research on public space over the last 40 years or so, from different disciplines, different journals, different areas of knowledge. And what we're recognizing is that there's huge amounts of material out there, but it's all fragmented in these different silos, different professions, and so on. So our goal is to bring it together into one comprehensive database and to look at that, to look at how important that is. And you can go online if you want to visit the sort of beta version of the database. I'm sorry you can't see the URL, but it's called Terra Publica, TerraPublica.org, and you're welcome to browse that and have a look. And with that, I think, bring up the next slide and I'll introduce the speakers. So as I mentioned, we're going to have David and Vikas, and we're going to have Seth Alo, who's our other colleague from the center working on the database, who can't be with us in person, but we'll have a short video from her. And then what I wanted to start off with was a special guest, and that is Steve Knight from David and Schwarz Architects. And guess what spectacular building they designed? This one right here, this beautiful Palladium. And I think you all recognize that's a fantastic building. And Steve was the project architect on that, by the way. And so what he's going to talk about is another wonderful project that I think is a civic anchor for the public spaces and the network of spaces in the city of Huntsville. So Steve, I'll turn it over to you. Steve Knight.
Good morning. Huntsville, Alabama. So I'll talk a little bit about a very transformative project in this city of about a metro region of about 500,000 people. Huntsville is Rocket City, a massive contributor to NASA and the aerospace industry. And that's very important in how the city has transformed and grown over time and how it thinks of itself. This statistic to me is astounding, that the city grew 7.5 times during the worst possible period that a city could grow in terms of urban design and infrastructure and architecture. Has very good demographics, very good economy, incredible workforce, very well situated with its demographics and its workforce and the educated level of the workforce, and the industry that backs it all up. This is a city that was basically a little sleepy cotton mercantile town, and then after World War II, with von Braun coming and in essence starting the aerospace support industry there, and then of course military spending and several universities based there as well. So the city really it took a pause in the first part of the 21st century and really started to they stepped back and thought, well, who do we really want to be? How do we want to grow? What do we want the city to look like? And there was this incredible opportunity with a 1.2 million square foot mall on about 100 acres, about 4 miles northwest of downtown, called Madison Square. It basically went bankrupt. As we know, this is happening with a lot of malls around the country. This is not a new story, but the statistics here are astounding in terms of, you know, those not just one death knell, but several that really spelt the demise of this place. So the city bought it, and they formed a partnership with a developer, and the project is underway. So this is the footprint that's highlighted here is a 30 square block region, a portion of the core, downtown core of Huntsville, overlaid on the site. And then this is the new project that is happening. So the mall has been demolished, a movie theater's been demolished. And I do think that what you're seeing here is, in ways, it's a snapshot in time. You still see some pad site development, you still see some surface parking that will hopefully transform over time. But the core project that you see in the middle of that image is well underway. The city purchased the land. They're responsible for the horizontal infrastructure, and then a private developer hired UDA out of Pittsburgh as their urban design consultant, and that private developer is responsible for all the vertical development. But what we're really here to focus on is the anchor of the anchor, so that the site is anchored by a 40-acre park to the left of the page, and at the southern tip of that will be our amphitheater. So let's talk a little bit about why culture, why music. The city it's tech-driven. It has a growing millennial workforce, and this is a community that's very interested in arts and really cherishing their leisure time. And if they're not getting it at Huntsville, they're going elsewhere. They're going to Nashville, they're going to Austin, they're going to Atlanta. And there really is an incredible tradition in northern Alabama of music that they wanted to capitalize on. So they hired a marketing firm called Sound Diplomacy, who did a full sort of marketing audit of the city in 2018. And they really came to the conclusion that this really was feasible, this was workable, that the arts is something we can build on, and we could really capitalize on it. So Nashville is about a 2-hour drive to the north, Atlanta about 2.5 hours to the southeast. So folks are regularly going there for the entertainment. Sometimes they're going a little further to New Orleans and Austin and Dallas, Huntsville. So that tradition I was speaking of, a little place about an hour to the west called Muscle Shoals, and just adjacent to it is Florence, the home of W.C. Handy, birthplace of the blues. You may not have heard of Muscle Shoals, but you've certainly heard of a number of the artists who went there to record and make really great music. It's one of those places that was on the bucket list still is for many great rock and roll artists. So that's what they wanted to capitalize on. That's what they wanted to build on. So what would you typically do? You would typically build, in this instance, what's known as a rock and roll shed on a large horizontal lawn with acres and acres of parking around it. That's not what Huntsville wanted. This is the city that, decided, well, we're going to send a man to the moon and we're going to safely return him back to Earth. This is a city that regularly, as my developer friend Max Grelier put it, we regularly punch above our weight. So a little bit about the project and the process and how we did it. And so what are the elements, what are some of the elements of that vision? They wanted something that was singular. They wanted something that was iconic, intimate, timeless. And this word that really resonated with everybody, communion. And I looked that up just to remind myself of what that meant this morning. And it means fellowship, it means sharing. There's a sense of intimacy. It's an intimate rapport between audience members, but even more importantly, between the artist and the audience. That's really important, and that's what they sought. There's a really great team. It obviously takes a great team to do something like this. You need not only good design professionals, you need operators. You need, so in our case, Ben Lovett with the English folk rock group Mumford & Sons, he's really the creative vision behind the project. He brought in Ryan Murphy to run the venue from St. Augustine. And then Madison House Presents is a group out of New York. They run the Forest Hills venue that used to be the home of the US Open tennis tournament. It's now a really great music venue. How the team was organized. You basically have the design consultants on one side with a direct contractual relationship to the city, and then the operations group, the Huntsville Venue Group, as that group is known, Ben and Madison House. And then, of course, we have a direct working relationship with them. It takes a lot of time. We've been at this for about 3 years. We have about another year to go in construction. We'll basically be up and running about the same time next year. I'm getting into a little bit more about the process. We did kick it all off with a charrette. I think charrettes are really good for building consensus and building it very quickly. It's a very efficient way to get a project up and running. And there's obviously a lot of prep that goes into this, a lot of research, a lot of precedent research. We want to come armed with lots of information and lots of material. And then, of course, we want to have all the stakeholders in the room at the same time. And there are about 7 design professionals in the room, and we were probably outnumbered 3 to 1 by the operations team, which was kind of vexing and annoying at times because they were constantly asking about, well, what kind of flush valves are you going to use on the toilets, and where are you going to put the trash, when we were trying to just get to the vision thing first. But it was enormously helpful. Again, I would just come back to that word, efficient, and a way of building consensus. And we also had the city in the room, and that was really important because what we learned quickly as we were just getting into the studies of how are we going to site it, what's it going to be, what does it need to be, we realized that what we needed was an elevated bowl. This could not be a lawn. You could not achieve communion with a lawn and a shed. So we were looking at, ancient antiquity precedents, Greco-Roman precedents. We were looking at the Hollywood Bowl, the Berkeley Theater, the tennis stadium in Forest Hills. Those were the kinds of places we were looking at. And of course, what happened is our budget in the process basically went from this to this. So it was really good to have the city in the room, because they were ultimately going to be scrolling the check for this, and they could realize that, and they could see the value that they were getting behind it. It got everybody up to speed very quickly. And it was a good working couple of days. We were basically holed up in a room in a hotel in New Orleans. Very well fed, well taken care of. These were some of the studies that we did, looking at the seating bowl, the configurations, the pitch, the number of seats, looking at just the kernel of the architecture, just again trying to get our arms around what does the place want to look and feel like. We sort of ended here after about 3.5 days. And then we had a great, we went to a rock concert, the Voodoo. It's a music festival, Voodoo Music Festival. It happens every year in October. So we got to really see and sense what it was we were trying to achieve and accommodate. That was really neat. And then we came back, and it was sort of back to, I don't want to say back to square one, but now it was really the time to roll up the sleeves and figure everything out. We love building models. It really is an integral part of our design process. And sort of where we ended up, and it's an amphitheater in a park, and there was it was an interesting strategic stroke to think of this not as don't take the ticket at the front door, but take the ticket at the edge of the park. So the site will have it'll be a combination of natural and physical barriers that can define sort of a 7-acre precinct with the amphitheater nestled into it. We preserved as much of the existing tree canopy as we could. It's basically a virgin site on the edge of that shopping mall, former shopping mall. So it can be a walk through the park, literally and figuratively, to get to the show, which really changes the experience, because there's all sorts of, to be vulgar about it, but alternative revenue streams, and the idea that this can be a whole afternoon experience. You're not just coming here for a show, but you can come here, you can have a meal, you can have a picnic, and then it's not just a venue for star acts either. It's a venue that will serve the community year-round. They will do community performances here. They'll have farmers markets. They will do yoga in the pit, all sorts of things. So just how the building is organized. Again, it is an elevated bowl that reaches up about 50 feet into the air. So organizing all the space under that bowl, very architecturally, very clearly. Symmetry is very important because it really contributes to wayfinding. You know where you are, and if you happen to come out house left when you meant to come out house right, it almost doesn't matter, because you'll still find a bathroom, you'll still find concessions, and you'll still find your way out and or back to your seat again. It's organized on essentially 3 levels. It's about 8,000 seats. So there's a ground level concourse, an upper concourse. The back of house facilities are really important. What I mean by that are the artist accommodations. So every dressing room here has direct access to the outdoors with either a terrace or a porch. That is really important. You have to set up the artists well. You have to take care of them, because if they're not taken care of and they don't have good accommodations, it just feeds directly into the quality of the show. And word gets around too. So the hope is that this will become yet another place on the artist's bucket list to perform. The uppermost tier it's sort of a VIP porch at the back, and then a kind of a bird's eye view. Mid-city will be in the distance where it's gray. So you'll filter around to the back of the hall, to the back of the amphitheater when you enter the site. And that was intentional primarily for acoustic orientation, to project the sound energy away from mid-city. It is quite a distance from the origin point to additional residents. So it was the right orientation. And it makes for sort of this interesting discovery aha moment when you come around to the front door. And then the experience, if you're at that VIP porch looking towards stage. And then I think most importantly, if you're on stage, again, coming back to that notion of communion, what's it like for the artist? And they really want to, again, they want to feel enveloped. So it's important to incline the audience so you're bringing people together, really, as that word implies. Press has been very important here, really getting the word out, and there's just been a tremendous amount of effort on the part of the operator. We oftentimes don't get that when we're designing these things. Sometimes the operator isn't hired until well after design is underway. But these folks have been on the ground for a couple of years now. They've been cultivating the audience, cultivating the elected officials, and really building that shared understanding of what we're trying to achieve. So this is where we are now as of a couple of weeks ago. I love that red clay. You get a great figure-ground relationship between the construction and the earth. And vertical walls going up. Thank you very much.
That's an amazing project, as you can see. And this building is an amazing building, as you can see. So the next speaker will be our good colleague Vikas Mehta, who is the Fruth Gemini Chair and Professor of Urban Design at the University of Cincinnati. And I think it's fair to say that Vikas is one of the world's foremost researchers in public space and in public space design, how to do it, what happens when you do it, and he's going to talk a little bit about some of his work. Vikas.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning. Several years ago, I did some work on the street as a public space. And when we were talking about IMCL, one of the things that Michael proposed was to talk about the street again. And I said, look, I've done this for many, many years. This was a topic of my dissertation to be a book in 2013. But this has become an interesting topic again in the COVID context. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about that. This research is still ongoing, and there are some interesting questions, not just for designers and planners, but really also for people who manage the city. And I know that there's a lot of people who are administrators who run places that we talk about planning and designing, and maybe there's some interesting questions for all of us here. So after the research on the street, I started to compare the street in the Western context with where I was from India. And the street is a very, very interesting typology because it is pan-cultural. It exists everywhere. In fact, it's existed before we even settled down into any small settlements. The idea of movement is very much the way that we are built. And so there are ways that we can actually compare the street across cultures, which can be very, very problematic. We understand that. But there's a simple way to sort of compare this as the street has evolved over time. So what I started to look at is to look at the street in the context of Asia, South America, and then obviously in the West. And what I figured was that the street often worked as a very complex ecology in many of the other cultures. And as ecologists talk about, there are ways that many, many things and many systems work together without the fear of conflict and collision. That conflict, overlaps, collision is actually part of the larger system. It's part of accepting how things develop and how things settle, and then it generates sort of new ideas and new ways to see things. So, and many people have talked about that. Weaver talked about it, and Jane Jacobs referred to Weaver talking about the complexity idea. So so I started thinking about the street as an ecology where it would be a place for lots of things together, where the understanding is that complexity, this web of relationships, is a good thing, that it's not something we want to flatten out every time. So let's see how this is going in the time of the pandemic. And in fact, while a lot of people have talked about the loss of public space, there's in fact some very interesting way that public space has been reinvented. So I'm just going to talk about that a little bit. We found that, last year when we were in this pandemic, we started to abandon public space. We were really, really sort of settling into our very, very small private area. And soon from there, we found that people started to adapt and started to do things in ways that are acceptable with minimal interactions. And that has led to a transformation that has, in some cases, sort of resulted in a contraction of public space. But in other cases, it's also transferred agency because the institutional agency had been weakened, right? If you went to the parks, you found there was no programming because you didn't want to do that. You didn't want to encourage people to come to a concert. But that agency transferred to a lot of the people, to individuals and to communities. And through that agency, there is a visible expansion. So let's see that a little bit from the city I live in, Cincinnati, not far from here. And these are pictures that you could take in any city, at least in the US, but around the world, that we found this abandonment of our public spaces and our streets, markets, the whole deal. But soon after, we also found, and we see this now, there is an adaptation. There is an understanding of reacting to those, whether it's businesses in need or whether it is facilities for care to be distributed to communities in the time of the pandemic, that we have started to adapt and change our public spaces, particularly the street that I'm talking about here. So we've seen a sort of myriad of things that are happening. There is slow streets, more bike lanes. There are, like I said, care facilities that are being organized in parklets. There's casual play. Of course, there's outdoor dining. Even within neighborhoods, there are cul-de-sacs that are turning into happy hour locations, music on the porches, the whole deal. It's actually very, very wonderful to see how the possibilities are right there, and we've actually used them in many, many ways. So here's a clunky adaptation, again in Cincinnati, with very, very quick fixes to try and create some space on the street by barricading and giving up parking spaces that the city would never give up in the last 20 years, right? Everybody knows you ask for a parking spot and you have to forget about it for the next 3 years. Nobody wants to lose a parking spot. But in the pandemic, all of these things became to be accepted. And that same adaptation has now turned into an expansion. So what you see as these very, very clunky things, let's see if I can go back, are now in the same locations becoming far more permanent, or at least quasi-permanent. In some of the cases where you see these concrete poured over several parking spots, that is permanent. That sidewalk is not 10 feet, 12 feet anymore. It is now 18 feet. It is 20 feet. Minor thing, but that is a major, major change in the way we think about what's going on the streets. But the expansion is also within neighborhoods, and that's actually very, very fascinating. Because we have built this society in the last 60, 70 years on a lot of mistrust, right? We all know, at least in the US, we are largely a place of the private realm, and we don't want to trust anything outside of it. We have these very small concentric circles where we are comfortable, and outside of that, we don't trust the city, we don't trust the places. It's crime and grime, as we know. But what we started to see in the pandemic, because there was a lot of abandonment and a lot of contraction in the public city, the private city started to come alive and people started to innovate. These are very simple examples, but these are people who are now walking in the middle of the street. And that might seem very, very banal to you, but it is not what we do here in the US. To walk in the middle of the street, even if there is no car, is actually an absolute no-no. You don't do that. This is the place for the vehicle. You walk on your 4 feet sidewalk. That changed, and that's huge, because it is changing your conception of what you own, where is your place in space, who is it for, what can it be? So here are just these couple examples of people starting to use places to chat, keeping their distance. This is pre-vaccination time, so you had to keep the 6-8 feet distance. But people in the neighborhood just taking walks, hanging out. The picture above is this very interesting edge of public to private, where somebody brews beer at home, puts it in their private property, but right at the edge of the sidewalk, and turns this private into a public, kind of neighborhood public, so parochial, but a public kind of realm, which is very, very fascinating to see in our context. But this is also not just happening in the leafy streetcar suburbs. It's also happening in inner cities, which obviously have a lot more problems in terms of what they could provide to the residents. But there was this moving out, expansion of public life in this city. So the very simple conceptualization of we have the public city, which also sociologists might refer to, as Anderson calls it, the cosmopolitan canopy, where we all go and we accept difference, we enjoy it, we welcome it. But there's also the private city, is closer to home, where we are much, much more territorial. So there is a shift of what is going on in both these areas. And the interesting part here is that the private city is becoming much more public, much, much more interesting. The way that children started to use space is, again, wonderful to observe, and it is exemplar. You know, the way that they could understand freedom in their neighborhoods is something that people who talk about child-friendly cities have been talking about, the deficit of play and nature. We started to see that happen because of the lack of cars or so on and so on. So this is a fascinating shift that we've seen in our cities in the pandemic. And then we also see how streets are being used for things that we typically don't. And again, you might find that in the largest metropolitan areas. You might find that in the most cosmopolitan areas or parts of a city, but not in more places than we are seeing. So whether it is gathering on the street with chairs and tables and playing, whether it's selling vegetables on a sidewalk, or whether it is setting up a hair salon on the sidewalk or on the street. That is not something we do. And that's actually fascinating that these shifts have happened during the pandemic. So we are moving from inside to out, which is very interesting to see. Again, it's not limited to just those. We see, people playing little mini concerts and people gathering and listening to that. Of course, there's all of this chalk art. In this little plaza in our neighborhood, there's a little area set up where small business owners can set up on this little table and sell their wares. And it sort of very casually shifts from whoever needs to do that. And then finally, the cultural arts center in the neighborhood had to basically close because they couldn't bring people in. And so they set up the art exhibition that happens every year right on the sidewalk for people to look and vote and the whole deal. So there's a lot of interesting possibilities that we are seeing in this time of challenge. Of course, we've also seen how we've claimed agency, not particularly related to the pandemic, but also of the social unrest that we've seen. So together, we've kind of seen a real interest in the way that the street is being used. People are, again, making their own rules. They're just saying this space is ours, and we can ride in the middle, walk in the middle, and the car is not going to rule this place. And so on and so forth. So, there's an agency, and the possibilities are enormous that we've seen right in front of us. And it's not academic anymore. There is actually talk about some lot of money to back this in terms of infrastructure that was discussed yesterday evening as well. So all of this together, in fact, creates a really interesting, unparalleled prospect, which is a lot of things colliding. And perhaps this may be a very glass half full kind of an argument, but I see this as a great opportunity for us to look at the street in a very different way, as a very, very different kind of public space. So, just to summarize some of the things, we've seen the transformation move from downtowns to neighborhoods a lot, places close to home. We've also seen that from destination type special use to much more everyday use, which is very, very important. If we think of this as becoming part of everyday life, there is much more longer run for it than when it is only special. Many more children and elderly, people have documented that through research, are out and about using the street. Much more of an everyday flexible kind of use, so not planned and pre-planned. And it's a lot more spontaneous. So that's really, really wonderful to see in the way that public space has been used. Again, the transformation is also much more open-ended, it's free, it's negotiated. So it's not coming from these rules set up by sort of the top-down institutions, it's negotiated within smaller institutional sort of communities, people themselves, which is fascinating. It's localized. That's, again, wonderful to see. It's empowering when things are localized, and it's flexible and a lot more public, even in the private city. I won't talk about this more too much, but there's also an interesting, what I call the new proxemics. So E.T. Hall has obviously, laid this out very well for us about where our personal spaces and private space and social space and so on. But during the pandemic, what I observed is that people were really, really yearning for social contact, and they did that outside of E.T. Hall's sort of diameter, if you will, or that range, that people were willing to be able to talk and make connections across 20 feet. And that's, again, very, very fascinating to see how you can relate to people at those distances. And the other important piece of this is that when you yourself, as a resident, start to walk, start to use the street as a public realm for the everyday, you build trust. Now you don't see and say, why is this person walking on the street? Why are they near my sidewalk? Remember, we talked about everybody's going to come from the inner city and take your televisions away, rob you. Because there was this huge mistrust about people walking. There's lots of stories about that in LA, but a lot of the other cities as well. So if you do these activities and behaviors yourself, you begin to trust them, and you begin to trust the behavior of that society itself. Last few things. So the transformation is actually quite complex. And while it might seem like it can be simplified from the public city becoming a little bit more shrunken, and the private city expanding a little bit more public, the way that we are transforming is a lot more complex, even in these little parklets or little spaces we are taking on the sidewalk. And here are just some examples. So certain things are becoming from public to more public. Other things are becoming ticketed public to public. Yet other things are becoming public to ticketed public, which is conditional. So, a parking spot is a ticketed public space, but if that is converted into outdoor seating, it is not only ticketed public space, it's also conditional that you have the money or the resources to buy that dinner at that place. So there's these very, very fine differences that we're noticing. Limited public space, such as a vehicle lane, could become restaurant seating, which is a limited public to a ticketed public. So there's a whole lot of this transformation that is in these different sort of categories, if you will, or micro categories that we are seeing. And this is particularly important for people who are running cities, people who are running these programs, to understand how are we transforming the street into what form to what form, and where is it becoming more or less public, and what are we doing at the whole city level. And I would urge sort of people who are in this business to keep a real close eye on this, because it doesn't take very long, like I showed you in Cincinnati, for things to become sort of permanent of a kind, and then realize that you've actually changed a public city to a less public city by changing the way streets have been modified. So I want to just sort of bring that up to not only to planners and designers, but also to the people who are really sort of running cities, who are administrators as well. Just a few slides that show you how this change has happened or happening from before to after. And we just want to be very careful that all of these things are not sort of privatizing the street for us in ways that it is not public for everyone. But here is also an opportunity where we can shift this from making this much more equitable, where we can in fact start to make places that are less public or ticketed much more public in the way we institute these policies. So we might think about, well, if we have to create an outdoor seating for a restaurant, can that also be a place where people, without purchasing anything from that restaurant, be allowed to sit, because the city has given that to those restaurants? So these might seem very simple, minor things, but they become important collectively when we review the public space or all of the streets in a particular city or a neighborhood. COVID has shown us that we can in fact use the street as an ecology, as a very, very sort of much more complete set of things, whether it is civic, or it's for exchange, or it's for social exchange, or it's for restorative use. All of these things are actually possible on the street. And this is, again, the idea that we want to keep an eye on this and use the pandemic as an opportunity to think about this as an ecology. It's not the time to romanticize it. We know that we've gone through a lot of pain, and some people more than others, but it is a time for us to think about the expansion of the street as an ecology. With that, thank you.
Thank you, Vikas. So important to recognize that streets are fundamentally important public spaces as well. David Brain will be speaking next. He's a professor of sociology at New College of Florida. And he's not just an academic, he's been involved in many projects and in the process of engaging with stakeholders, dealing with the issues of civic participation, and how do you get people knowledgeable and constructive rather than destructive, and engaging in projects in a way that helps to improve the collaboration and the quality of the outcome. He's also a mean dobro player, by the way. So, David.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you all for being here and being patient. This will be something different from what Vikas was presenting. My original idea for this talk was to talk about the idea of urban design as a way of organizing civic innovation, of really shaping the way people engage with the shared world. Moving beyond our usual ways of thinking about community participation. Then I noticed that the panel was actually labeled Learning from COVID. So I thought, okay, here's an opportunity to draw some COVID lessons that are a little different from what you've mostly been hearing. So the question that is often being asked is what the experience of the pandemic teaches us about public space, right? And it seems to me that one of the reasons public space might not recover is sort of following on the usual critique of a lot of contemporary public space. There's this idea that there's been a long process towards the end of public space due to what's called privatization and securitization. But what I'd like to suggest is that underlying those processes is a fundamental problem in the way we understand the nature of public space, typically as an open access resource. And I want to suggest a different way of thinking about it. And I think our solutions to problems in public space are often hampered by the way we tend to think of it only in terms of rights of use, and not in the larger context of the way cities are co-produced. So part of what I'm trying to do is suggest reimagining public space as a special case in a broader understanding of what I like to call the urban commons. So here's my pandemic lessons. You might have followed the recent exchange between Senator Paul, and Dr. Fauci over the issues of continuing to wear masks even after being vaccinated. And Senator Paul said, and he asked Dr. Fauci pointedly, what studies do you have that people that have had the vaccine or have had the infection are spreading the infection? If they're not spreading the infection, isn't it just theater? And I'll suggest that in a way, Senator Paul was correct. There is a theater part to it. And Dr. Fauci had trouble with this, responding, I noticed, because he wanted to provide rational reasons for wearing masks, because that's how we justify things, right? We have uncertainty about whether transmission can continue when you're vaccinated. We have some uncertainty about the new variants and whether the vaccines would be efficacious. We have a lot of uncertainty about the efficacy of masks in disrupting community transmission. When I say uncertainty, I'm not saying that there's a lot of scientific uncertainty, but uncertainty among the public. And I think what Dr. Fauci was struggling with is the fact that, as I said, Senator Paul was correct, that wearing masks is a performative activity. It's not just a rational activity. And so that's why we got this divide between those who wanted to wear masks to represent their ongoing vigilance in stopping the transmission of the virus, and those who saw refusing to wear masks as an assertion of an opportunity for individual choice over any responsibility for the commons. And it seems to me that this is a very interesting and dramatic lesson in political theory that reveals a lot about political culture in the US. We have this struggle between the historic struggle that has created sort of two threads of political vision throughout the history of the US, where you have the assertion of liberal individualism against a backdrop of civic responsibility. So Dr. Fauci is arguing, given what we know and what we don't know, it makes sense to be cautious. Senator Paul is arguing, given what we know and don't know, it makes sense to err on the side of not limiting people's freedoms. So this kind of highlights this divide between a kind of classical liberalism, where politics is seen as the competition between potentially conflicting interests, and classical republicanism, small r, where politics is seen as a process of cooperation in governance that's oriented towards recognizing and implementing a common good. What tends to happen, and if you're familiar with the old essay from the 60s by Garrett Hardin, The Tragedy of the Commons, so we tend to err on the side of that traditional liberal and that classical liberalism. And this is what we see in Hardin's argument about the tragedy of the commons. The assumption is that rational actors will always exploit a common resource to the point of exhaustion. So what Hardin suggested, and he was arguing about population control, the solution is either you privatize the resource or you regulate it from the top down. Those are the two solutions that we're stuck with if we define the problem in these terms. But the thing is that this is an essay that wasn't really about the commons. It was about management of an open access resource. And in thinking about public space, I want to emphasize that public space is not an open access, not simply anyway, an open access resource. As an actual commons in cities, public space is a web of social relations that run a spectrum from the most private and intimate to the most public, from formal to informal, and it's all sustained in the context of a normative and symbolic order. In public space, we signal to each other. We engage in what sociologists call symbolic interaction. And this happens in a world where you have multiple publics, not a single public, but multiple publics engaging in these spaces. Robert Putnam, who's the big guru in political science with respect to the idea of social capital, argued that you have to see social capital not as a resource that's available for individuals pursuing their self-interest, but as what he called a moral resource that is created by the web of association. And if you think of public space in these terms, you can then understand that public space is not a resource that's exhausted by shared use, but a resource that's actually constituted by shared use and by the quality and the character of that sharing, right? So understanding public space as a commons has to do with understanding it as a shared thing and as a process of sharing. So I think of this in terms of what I imagine as the intentional city, in contrast with what has been called the rational city. And urban design, of course, is very different from designing other kinds of things, a fax machine, a single building, any kind of object. Urban design is a process of adaptive change over time. It's a process rather than an end product, and it tends to be the work of many hands. So there's a temporal dimension, and there's a collective dimension to it. So it's essentially, urbanism is a normative order that's actively produced and reproduced over time through a very complicated play of constraints and choices, virtues and necessities. And generally what we do in making culture is we make virtue out of necessities. We look for ways of articulating domains of meaningful choice against a backdrop of things that we take as limiting constraints. So the question in urban design is, how do we construct this domain of meaningful choices that we can all engage in shaping the common world? And to me, that's what's interesting about urban design, is it's a process of creating that capacity to be able to shape the common world. So I always use this pair of images with students to demonstrate the difference between the typical suburban landscape and urbanism, where you have, instead of an aggregation of pieces that just add up to more stuff, you have a process of each piece contributing to a cumulative effect over time so that it's possible for things to get better, right? So urbanism is essentially a normative notion of accumulating stuff that gets better. So then the challenge of designing public space becomes an interesting one. I found this recently, this slogan developed by the Project for Public Spaces. I think Bruce Mao designed this tote bag. And the first thing that occurred to me was, well, how do we make this slogan something we can practically realize, made by all, used by all? And it occurred to me that we really can't unless we get at the kind of underlying politics of urbanism and think about what's implied in this distinction between the making of public space and the using of public space. And then it occurred to me that, in fact, we make public space precisely by using it, right? That the distinction kind of disappears, or we should imagine it disappearing. In contrast, designing the rational city as opposed to the intentional city, typically, and this is from William White's old work, you're designing public space rationally often becomes a matter of shaping experience and shaping people's behavior. It becomes essentially a kind of manipulative thing. Can we understand design in relation to social psychology in a way that lets us create behavioral outcomes, or at least accommodate typical behavioral outcomes? But I think that misses a bigger point about what you're actually trying to accomplish when you're designing public space. Jane Jacobs made this phrase, this idea of eyes on the street, sort of a common notion. And it had a tendency to be translated into a notion of kind of universal surveillance. So I always like to draw the distinction between eyes on the street that have a face and eyes on the street that have no face. The closed-circuit television camera is very different from Jane Jacobs looking out the window. In more kind of general sociological terms, it's the difference between creating an environment of mutual visibility and creating a condition of panoptic surveillance. It's true that you can control behavior through panoptic surveillance. This is an idea that goes way back to Jeremy Bentham. But it's a very different kind of order that you're producing. This technologically managed kind of social order, as opposed to the normative order that Jane Jacobs was actually referring to as the web of respect and trust. So what you're doing when you're creating and what you aspire to create is that web of respect and trust. You're not simply looking for certain behavioral outcomes. This is traffic engineering to me is the epitome of the rational city. Right? The idea of at least conventional traffic engineering is that what you're up to is you're managing the efficient flows of a lot of disconnected choices by individualism. So this is what in environmental education we refer to as the hidden curriculum. Right? The structure of institutions, the structure of places teaches a kind of liberal individualism rather than a kind of civic responsibility. Another example of the same thing, this is a pair of images from DPZ's plan for the Gentilly neighborhood in New Orleans. This is the existing condition where you have that kind of disaggregated landscape of conventional suburban development where there is an order there, but it's abstract rather than concrete and visible and emergent. It's an order characterized by disorganized complexity, as Jane Jacobs referred to it. And then here you have the architecture, and at least an aspiration to the architecture of an urban commons. It's what Jane Jacobs called organized complexity. It's an order that emerges over time. It takes shape over time. It adapts over time. And it involves the explicit expression of urban intentions. And I'll explain what I mean by that, urban intentions. If we think at the broader scale that is described by the rural to urban transect, if you think of that as describing a whole ecology of different kinds of places that make up a metropolitan area, what you see is a pattern in which, as you move from the most rural to the most urban, you get more direct, more explicit, and more significant articulation between public and private. Always remembering that the distinction between public and private, that even the very definition of the public depends upon that distinction and how you draw it, how you negotiate it. So this idea of the transect describes basically how the physical environment changes as you move from rural to urban, but it also is pointing to really key social changes in the way we interact with each other and the kind of social order that's operating. So we can begin to see the kind of abstraction of the so-called public realm as a very concrete and specific kind of visual or spatial order. And when I say spatial order, I'm always worried that people will imagine that I mean a very controlled environment. But to think about the visual and spatial order of the city is that it's a pattern of order and disorder. It's a pattern in which intentions are articulated against a background of historical contingencies that you don't control. And figuring out, what do we control? What can we do to express our intentions and state who we are and who we aspire to be, as opposed to what do we just simply have to accept? And I always find myself objecting to a lot of the discussions of urbanism as if it were simply an objective condition that happens like the weather, when in fact urbanism involves this play between things we do on purpose and things that we see as just happening. So thinking of the public realm in this way means that you can think of two ways in which the web of social relations is manifested. It's manifested in the way the articulation of the public and the private are expressed and managed in the built environment, and also in the social practices that evolve around occupying those spaces, in the way we negotiate not just the conditions of those social spaces, the normative order of those social spaces, but also how we negotiate the presence of very diverse others. Implications for public space is that I think then we have to think of public space not as a unique thing, but as part of this whole broader context of the structuring of urban space. And also, as I'm suggesting, this articulation of intentions. I love Vikas's, and I often use his street as ecology imagery, but what I'm emphasizing is that urban design becomes the articulation of intentions in the context of that ecology. And as such, urban design becomes essentially a political act that I think we could be more self-conscious about. One of the ways that I've found this in the research on public space is the example of Bogota and the remaking of public space in Bogota. They explicitly set out to remake the public space of the city, not just to make it pretty, make it safe for consumption. They explicitly set out to sort of reshape the relationship between citizens, public space, and the government. It was really a rebuilding of the conditions for democratic governance in a city that was plagued by a lot of problems. Am I running out of time, Michael? Okay. So this brings me back to the original title of the original focus of my talk before I got set off on this tangent about wearing masks. Beyond community participation, the conventional approach to thinking about community participation is to think about it in terms of the political theory that is associated with liberal individualism. It's typically a pluralist vision, where you imagine a world that's made up of conflicting interests that then aggregate into factions that are divided. And what you try to do is create solutions that you can assemble a coalition to support. It's solutions that are always a compromise between these conflicting views. And then in that context, the key question becomes, well, how do we make it inclusive? But we often forget to ask the question, what are we actually trying to include people in? And a lot of the political science research has suggested that what we do, in fact, by trying to be inclusive is very often achieve exactly the opposite of what we hope. Instead of making decisions more legitimate, more acceptable, better decisions by having broader participation, we actually create frustration, conflict, and alienation from the process. So we have to think about what the process is. So the other vision is what I'm calling civic innovation, a phrase that I also get from the political science research that involves focusing on the process and not the outcome, focusing on how you can create a process that transcends those conflicting interests to work towards a collaborative solution that's effectively a synthesis and not simply a compromise. And to imagine that at each point, as you're solving a planning problem, what you're also trying to do is build civic capacity, build the capacity to engage people effectively and in a rewarding way in the process of shaping their common world. I've found in a lot of my work observing the charrette process that when it works right, when it's done correctly, that you can organize a process around a collaborative design process that engages people very concretely, very specifically, in a very focused way, moving from the details to the big picture, so that they move from a common vision that can be articulated to actually effective action. And it really constructs what sociologists like to call collective efficacy, which is a manifestation also of social capital. So this is why I want to argue that urban design can be civic innovation, because it's a way of articulating very clearly the relationship between private interests and the common good. In classical republicanism, Alexis de Tocqueville wrote of the United States in the 1830s that we understood self-interest was self-interest properly understood. recognizing the connection between self-interest and common interests. And what that involves, if we look at the political theory behind that, is being able to reconfigure the relationship between leadership, expertise, and citizenship. And it's been very frustrating in recent years, and all of those that I know who are involved in elected office, exercising democratic leadership, all of those that I know who are involved in planning as technical experts get very frustrated with engaging with citizens. But to me, it's clear that what we have to do is think about how we can shape a process that reconnects those different aspects, so that leadership really becomes leadership in relation to responsible citizenship that is capable of recognizing, explicating, celebrating, and reproducing over time a kind of urbanism that celebrates civic connection rather than simply being the result of endless conflict. I'm also, just as an aside, really interested in a lot of the various movements towards a kind of bottom-up urbanism, tactical urbanism, incremental development, lean urbanism, each of which has its flaws, each of which has its limitations. But what they represent to me is different ways in which the kinds of agency that enable people to be actively and effectively engaged in shaping the common world can be shifted out of the hands of the technical experts and into the hands of those who are both making and using places. So just to wrap up, why does public space matter? I'd argue that public space matters at a very fundamental level, as Jane Jacobs argued, in fact, that it is essentially the core of what it means to have urbanism. And the Terra Publica splash page says, without public space, you don't have a city. But what it's really pointing to is that you don't have a city if you don't have ways of realizing a kind of civic ideal, realizing connections that transcend conflicting interests, and do so in a way that's everyday, as well as the great, we have lots of great ritual occasions where we give lip service to civic ideals, but the experience of the street, the experience of not so beautiful but active public space is an everyday practice of that civic ideal. I think one of the things we've done by reducing planning to technical expertise with occasional public participation is we've actually helped to undermine that experience of connection to a shared world, that engagement and that collective efficacy. And I've seen again and again in public meetings the way citizens get so frustrated and disillusioned and form this fundamental distrust of developers, elected officials, public sector planning staff. So I think we've created a system that if we wanted to undermine democracy on purpose, we've done a pretty good job. And so if we think of public space and in general, the process of planning and urban design as really being about reviving the constructive politics of public life. What I've seen is, in particular, design as opposed to planning. Design helps people have a vision of what things could be, and designers can help citizens articulate that vision in very precise and concrete ways, give them a language, both visual and a narrative about the visuals that enable people to create and recreate this web of respect and trust. And that, I think, should be behind a lot of our work in public space, that ultimate goal. We talk about it in terms of, isn't it great that people of all backgrounds can get together? Yes, that's exactly right. But what really makes a difference is I don't just want to see photographs of people of different colors, partying in public space. I don't want to just see leisure time activities. I want to see people living and working and experiencing the city and the everyday fabric of social life in the city in terms of that public life. And keeping that goal in mind, that broader goal of public space as a fundamental characteristic of a broader pattern of urbanism, I think is really critical. Julian Eigenmann talks about this in terms of just sustainabilities, keeping the social equity questions front and center. And I think, that's clearly a part of it. But a big piece of it for me is just, keeping that bigger picture of the city as a shared world that we are capable of creating together. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you, David. So we're going to have a very brief video that's going to amplify many of these same points from our colleague Satha Low, who some of you know, who are academics, probably recognize that she's also one of the foremost scholars on public space, and we're privileged to have had her as a colleague working at the center. I'm speaking to Satha Low, who is an anthropologist and an environmental psychologist who is based at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and she's the head of the Public Space Research Group. And Satha, we've been working together for a long time on public space research. One of the looming questions, of course, is why is public space important? What is it about public space that makes it such an important public good?
Believe it or not, the simplest question of why public space matters is both the easiest question to answer and yet at another level the very hardest. You can say to people, well, it's where our children get grown up. It's where we can get fresh air. It's where families in New York or in Latin America who live in apartments can have huge barbecues and be together. It's a place where we can run and be healthy. They're the lungs of the city. It's the connective tissue. But all of that to everyone seems like, well, they take that for granted in some countries, and they're not also imagining neighborhoods in their own cities. Again, I'm going to go back to New York or even San Jose, Costa Rica, where I live. And in fact, there aren't those kinds of places for everyone. And that those are places to work, those are places to connect, those are places of dissent, those are places of communication, they're places of memory, and in fact are the fiber of social solidarity for so many communities. And without them, social life would really be bereft. And that's even without touching the kinds of things you are interested in, Michael, which has to do with the connection of parts of the city, of the way we move, of the wildlife corridors, or any of the runoff bases, or having green, or all the other kinds of ecological concerns. I mean, I admit that my goal in life, or in my work, and now in my career, has been to improve social relations, to be tolerant, respectful, just, caring, to make our cities even more that way at moments in which it seems like there's so much conflict. If you go into any small part of the city, you can really foster new kinds of relations, new kinds of hope, new images of the future. And that's why public space matters. But a lot of the people, at least in the United States that I speak to, maybe less so in Costa Rica or Argentina, where I go often, will say, but Setha, why through public space? And I go, well, public space is the microcosm of our entire societies. Everything that happens in our worlds, both in terms of meaning and in terms of politics and economics, are represented in our public spaces. And if we can make them or create them in a way that's really healthy and viable and vibrant, and in my case, not private necessarily, but truly public for all and truly inclusive for all, I'm imagining that will also represent the kind of societies that we're creating.
Setha, you and I were involved in the Habitat 3 conference where the outcome document known as the New Urban Agenda was adopted with a lot of emphasis on public space and livability. quality of life, and that's related to the Sustainable Development Goals as well. And that was adopted by acclamation by all 193 countries of the United Nations, which is a big deal. But there's a huge challenge for implementation. And so what do you see as the key lessons for this moment in history?
I think there are people all over the world really committed to trying to free, just, democratic, healthy public space. And yet, we're all working separately. We're all doing these things differently. I mean, as I said, I'm an anthropologist. I'm an academic. I'm interested in field studies. I'm working on this great database project in which we're looking at all kinds of research from all the different disciplines and what it can tell us about how to make public space better for everyone throughout the globe. And yet, at the same time, I know I have counterparts everywhere in the world. And one of the reasons that these meetings are so important and why it's a step beyond Habitat 3, where we were able to get public space, right, on the agenda, on the new urban agenda, that was so important. Well, okay, that's there now. Now what do we do about it, and how do we prioritize what kinds of interventions? Who's going to do the interventions? In my case, how do I get the years of research that either I've done, my colleagues have done, we collectively have done, how do we get it into the design and planning of the new urban world that we're looking at? How do we create a really just city, a just city that in which there's public space for all in all the ways possible? I hate to say it, but I don't think we have done enough to bring us all together and to look at what each of us can bring to the table. Hopefully, collectively, we can pull together and have a much bigger impact than we've been able to over the past, say, 20 years, because now the moment is right, and now we have the backing of the new urban agenda. Now we have UN Habitat with us and leaders from all over the world really caring about the new world we're creating and what can we do to make it better.
Thank you, Seta.